Welcome to First Congregational Church in Guilford, Connecticut, where we say, whoever you are and wherever you are on life's journey, you are welcome here. On this Sunday, the last Sunday in July for 2023, we are so glad that you've decided to come to worship with us this morning. For our ministry assistant, Penelope Rebuzzini, will be offering our reflection. Penelope has her MDiv from Duke Divinity School. She has worked at our church about 20 years and held the role of office manager and now ministry assistant. She is a gift to us all. Her spiritual center helps move us, and I hope that happens for you this morning. So as you prepare for this time, please take a moment and shake off the week and roll shoulders back. Open hands and hearts and minds. Let us take a deep breath in, breathing in the breath of God, and breathe out the love of God. And let's continue now with the scripture today, which is from 1 Kings chapter 3. At Gideon, God answered to Solomon in a dream by night and said, "Ask what I should give you." And Solomon said, "You have shown great and steadfast love to your servant my father David, because he walked before you in faithfulness and righteousness, and in uprightness of hearts toward you, and to all you have kept for him this great and steadfast love, and have given him a son to sit on his throne today. And now, my God, my Creator, you have made your servant king in place of my father David. Although I am an only little child, I do not know how to go in or to come out. And your servant is in the midst of the people whom you have chosen, a great people, so numerous they cannot be numbered or counted. Give your servant, therefore, an understanding mind to govern your people, able to discern between good and evil." May God grant us wisdom and understanding to this passage.
Give your servant, therefore, an understanding mind to govern your people. Other Bible translations use the words, a discerning heart, a heart to understand, or wisdom. Whatever translation you read, the sense is clear that Solomon was asking for his heart and head to be aligned with God's will. As we enter Solomon's story, he had succeeded his father David as king. He went to a local shrine to worship because the temple in Jerusalem had not yet been built. In ancient times, if one wanted to receive a message from God, they would go and sleep at a sacred site with the hope and expectation that God would speak to them there. God did come to Solomon in a dream and asked Solomon for what God should give him. As I sat with Solomon's dream, I wondered, if that were my dream, what would I ask God for? Given all the needs of the world and those in my own heart, what would I ask for? What would you ask for? I was struck by a few things in this story. Solomon's attitude of humility, his absolute trust in God, and God's trust in Solomon. As the new ruler, I assumed that Solomon might be full of himself, but he is not, at least not with God. He referred to himself and his father as servants. He knew his place in God's realm as one created in the image of God, but he was not God. As the new king with all the responsibility he now held, He was humble enough to realize he was inexperienced, not prepared for this task to which he had been called. Solomon knew what he didn't know, and that he needed God's help to do it. Solomon was teachable. Being teachable goes way beyond the ability to learn something new. Being teachable means being willing to be changed. Our attitudes, perspectives, our faith. Being teachable is being willing and open to allow God not only to work in and through us, but allow God to work us. And I have the image of a bread baker kneading the dough. I can see Peter at his breadboard. Our relationships with God and with each other are what change us. My husband Peter, if you don't know him, is a construction equipment mechanic by trade, but he can fix many things, and he understands how they work. I, on the other hand, really don't care how my car works, or other things for that matter, only that they do work. Through him, I've learned a lot about his work and troubleshooting issues and appreciating the care needed to keep things running well. His interests and knowledge of history, Guilford and beyond, and his grasp of current events have opened my world in so many ways. And I'm not sure that either Peter or I would ever have been ballet or dance enthusiasts were it not our daughter Keziah's passion. I never knew or appreciated the athleticism and the discipline that are required to produce such beauty. The web of these relationships that their interests and passions gave me have expanded my world and my faith, have blessed us as a family. Returning to Solomon's story, Solomon trusted that God could and would help him. He turned to God in his moment of need, and God was trusting him to lead God's people. Sometimes I'm amazed by that, given that as humans, the clamoring of our egos can easily drown out God's still small voice that's speaking. Yet God trusts us to be God's hands and heart in the world. Solomon's prayer wasn't just a prayer for himself. What he asked for was relational, for the benefit of God's people he was chosen to lead. He understood himself as connected to God and to God's people, not an I, but a we. In that way, Solomon was saying, "Your will for us, O God, not mine." This reminds me of a story from our congregation. In a sermon preached here by a former interim minister, I heard this story. That one Sunday years ago during worship, Al Bishop, father of Diane and Keith and husband of Barbara, asked for prayers as he and Bishop's Orchards were discerning whether to expand the store to include other things other than fruit. Al understood this decision as including God and impacting his community, and invited his church family to pray. When we allow ourselves to be vulnerable and teachable, new worlds and new ministries open up, and God changes us. We may not have the responsibility before us that Solomon had, yet each of us has big decisions in our lives with implications for others, our families, our colleagues, our communities. And then there are the many small day-to-day decisions that can still stress and overwhelm us when we, like Solomon, can ask for what we need. So, while gathered as this faith community in worship, with our hearts open to God, pause for a moment right now and ask your heart, what do I want to ask God for? What is the longing deep in my heart and soul that I want to ask God's help with? what would you ask God for yourself? What would you ask God for yourself? What would you ask for this community, for the world? And if you struggle this morning and are unable to name something, trust that God hears that prayer too. Paul reminds us in his letter to the Romans that the Spirit comes to help us in our weakness when we don't know how to pray. The Spirit prays for us in groans that cannot be put into words. We have an advocate. And be assured that we're not just allowed one question in our life. We can ask for what we need day by day, and some days those questions are moment by moment. It all comes down to trust, trusting that God is present and listening and wants to be part of our lives. This is what the kingdom of heaven looks like. And part of Jesus' ministry was to teach his followers and us what the kingdom of heaven looks like. God's realm was about a radical new order, where the Roman rule was about hierarchy and power and privilege. With its currency of fear and oppression, God's realm turned all that on its head. I wonder if those who listened to it may have been confused at first, but as they saw the signs of hope and love and changed lives, they couldn't help but want this new world. A world where all are equal and kin, where there's no ladder of accomplishments on which we are judged or labeled. This realm with its surprising radical forgiveness and extravagant welcome of the father of a prodigal child, where the offering of 5 loaves and 2 fish multiplies exponentially the generosity and feeds a large crowd, where a tiny seed becomes a huge shrub, offering a place for shade and nesting. A world where God's hope and love is hidden like yeast in the loaves, feeding our spirits and enabling us to share that with others. God's realm is about the joy of finding a treasure hidden in a field, and the joy of a willing sacrifice to sell everything to get it. Jesus' kingdom parables gave hope and allowed those who listen, as well as this community gathered, to envision a different world where the currency is love, always love, and hope and grace and kindness and justice and equity and trust. As Riley reminded us last week, faith is not a solo sport. Yes, faith has an individual expression. We each have our own relationship with God to nourish. Yet we need a faith community to know our belonging in God, to be nourished as well as challenged. And we at First Church are an expression of the kingdom of heaven here and now. We are the kin in kingdom. We need one another to live God's vision when much of our culture believes in a ladder of worthiness and the currency of fear and oppression. We help one another and the world to know and to trust that hope and love are at work all the time, just like the yeast, even when we can't see it. Clara, our former ministerial intern, introduced us to the First Nations version of the New Testament. That version calls the kingdom of heaven the good road from above. I love that image. The life of faith is the road that we travel together with God and with one another in trust and love. It's the trust that our forebears had when they signed the Guilford Covenant, pledging to stick together and share gifts so that all could survive here. We continue that trust as we covenant together as a congregation every time new members or confirmands are welcomed, pledging ourselves in trust to God and to one another. Jack's baptism here today is another expression of the kingdom of heaven. Jesus' message of God's love and hope is passed to a new generation. Jack's parents, Kara and Evan, promised to raise him in the faith, and this congregation promises to support them on that journey. I close with a quote I found in my reading. Unfortunately, I didn't save the author's name. Faith is fundamentally a confession of trust, an embodiment of how we relate to God and thus to each other as children of God. Faith is not a yes to doctrine, but a yes to the God who creates us, who saves us, the God who draws us to new life. Beloved faith community, our call is to a living faith, a relational faith, a kingdom faith, to say yes to God, to trust God is here, and to trust in each other as the community that God has gathered here. God asks, tell me what you need. What does your heart need? What will you ask God for? Amen.
Come, great God of all the ages, make your earthly mission known. Speak through every deed and person.